Hi there. In this video we're going to be talking about the way that the population of the American colonies was changing during the 1700s, and we're also going to be talking about the Enlightenment. Both of these conversations sort of lead inexorably up to the American Revolution. Now, what we're going to talk about really here is what happened when all of these different splotches of color got together and started interacting. And what these splotches of color represent is the massive wave of immigration that came to America during the 1700s. Prior to this point in this class so far, we've talked essentially about two areas. One of those areas is right here in Massachusetts and the rest of New England, and the other one of those areas is right around here, which is the coastal area in Virginia and North Carolina. So today we're going to start expanding that narrative. And although we won't be getting too in-depth in any of these specific people, we're going to expand it geographically into Pennsylvania, and then almost by implication down into the western parts of North Carolina and Virginia and even into South Carolina. Because what actually happened along with these movements of people from Germany and Scotland and Ireland and elsewhere like Sweden, a lot of people ended up coming into Philadelphia and then migrating down south into North Carolina and Virginia. So we're going to be talking about all of these people. And what I will say is that for a long time, the story that historians told about these migrations was one of becoming American. And you can sort of see that narrative, the narrative of becoming American, with this version of this map. And I want you to notice this. This is just an interesting little color trick, but it's the same map. It's slightly squigglier in some places, but it essentially shows the same processes: Germans, Scots-Irish, Africans, and more Germans coming to America. But the story that historians told over most of the 1900s, and even prior to that, was of all these people eventually looking alike. I love here that they essentially take on the same color. They're all blue-green or brownish in this map. And the narrative that historians used to tell there does that. It shows these people coming together and starting to share more than what differentiated them. They all ended up looking and talking and acting essentially the same. There's your melting pot. But what historians have done over the last 30 or 40 years is look at the same map with a different lens. And that lens has suddenly started looking at all of these people as different groups. So suddenly we've got these orange German, and we've got these, magenta Dutch. I don't even know what that would mean, and blue Scottish, and green Scots-Irish, etc., etc., etc. Now that change in emphasis isn't just historians deciding to change what they're talking about. It's not like everyone just said, well, we've talked about sameness for a long time, now let's talk about difference. Instead, what it is historians looking at evidence in different ways and actually starting to look at new evidence. So one thing that historians have done is pay a lot more attention to what all of these Scots-Irish and Germans, and when we can find evidence, Africans and even Welsh people, etc., were actually saying about their experience. And what they found is something more complex than just everyone starting to look the same. What they found, in fact, is that coming to America in some ways increased people's sense of being German. Now, Germany in the 1700s was not what Germany is today. We can look at Germany on a map and say, huh, that's Germany. That was not possible in the 1700s. Instead, Germany was made up of all sorts of little kingdoms and city-states and duchies in which people felt very, very different from their neighbors. But coming to America ended up changing that. So people from all over around in Vienna, for instance, might have thought of themselves as being very different from people from Berlin, for instance. But when they got to Pennsylvania and their neighbors started stereotyping them as all Germans, and they found themselves to be very much alone, suddenly they started thinking about themselves as Germans. So in some ways, coming to America actually increased their sense of being different. One of the eternal ironies of American history is that of former immigrants looking down on current immigrants for not being quote-unquote American. But you can actually see how that works here. If you come from England in the year 1700 and have decided after 30 years that you're an American, a whole lot of German people coming in 1740 is suddenly going to feel really different from what you're used to. So I'd like to know, as we talk, what you think about this changing vision of immigration. In particular, I'd like to know what you think the evidence says about it. What do our documents say about it? Which map seems more correct? Is it this one or the older version? And do you see cracks in the facade of the argument that says people felt different when they came to America? Now, regardless of that changing story, it's certainly true that many historians argue that all of this immigration was having an impact. New York, Richmond to a lesser extent, and especially Philadelphia were becoming spectacularly heterogeneous cities, which means heterogeneous simply means many people. And they had many different kinds of people coming into them. Here's a little bit of the port of Philadelphia, and you can see all of these different boats coming in. And they're bringing hundreds of people and thousands of people actually every year. And with those new people, almost unavoidably came new ideas. In particular, the ideas of one immigrant group, the Scots, and the ideas of Americans who went to Scotland to study were becoming extremely influential. These ideas were those of the Scottish Enlightenment. And if you've never heard of the Scottish Enlightenment, that's fine. But if you've never heard of John Locke or Adam Smith, you need to get on the internet right now and do that. The ideas of people in the Scottish Enlightenment were being spread in urban centers like Philadelphia and New York and Boston, and they were spread at places like this, like coffee houses and taverns, which were sort of like a bar today or a Starbucks today, but with much better reading material. And those ideas had a major impact on many Americans who would be very influential during the Revolution. For instance, James Madison, who wrote most of the Constitution, and Thomas Jefferson, who wrote most of the Declaration of Independence, became very interested in the ideas of John Locke, as well as Adam Smith. And in fact, the ideas of the Enlightenment made perfect sense in a heterogeneous, urban cosmopolitan setting. Those ideas were about looking for universal truths, about seeking common humanity in people despite one's differences, and looking beyond the whole notion of nations and kings and trying to find natural law. So those ideas were really good for a continent that was not only now starting to think rebellious thoughts about their king, but also welcoming large groups of different people who didn't share the same national histories as North America's earlier English colonists did. And they would be absolutely crucial to framing the American Revolution. However, I should say, this little confession, we are now headed right back toward the traditional narrative, and that traditional narrative is of Americans starting to think about themselves in a way that is different from England. And, you know, I'm a little scared of traditional narratives anyway, but I'm particularly scared of this traditional narrative because of what another historian has done. And one or two historians in the last 10 or 15 years have started to look at the way that people in America described themselves in the 50 years or so before the American Revolution. And what they have discovered is that in the 1700s, just as they were preparing and laying the intellectual groundwork for moving away from England, Americans actually started to feel more and more attached to their English identity. So people like Ben Franklin and George Washington were perfect examples of this. All the way up until the American Revolution, they felt enormously proud of being English, and probably, in fact, more proud of being English than their counterparts would have felt, say, 100 years earlier. Now, if the notion of Americans in the 1700s suddenly feeling more English than they had previously might sound a little ridiculous, I'd like us to look at a little fashion show and think about what the clothes they're wearing, what the postures they're adopting, tell us about how Americans thought about themselves. The people that we're going to see over the next 4 slides were all of, I believe, English heritage, so they weren't, say, the Germans or Swiss or certainly Africans coming to America in the 1700s, but most of them were or could have been patriots. They were perfectly willing and eager to side with the Patriots against the British in the Revolutionary War. And what you see in these pictures here is Americans looking like British aristocrats. So look at this beautiful blue coat that David Franks is wearing here, and the wife with this rich, sumptuous red dress and holding a lap dog. These pictures were, this image was meant specifically to imitate or mimic what British painters were showing aristocratic people dressing like and behaving like in this time period. And we've got the same thing here. I love this picture. Look at again at the pretty dog. Look at the swans in the lake, and look at the man wearing the rich red coat. The people in this landscape, by the way, that's 1775, not 1875. Sorry about that. The people in this landscape are almost adorable. They look like British aristocrats sitting out on a more rustic version of the Thames. And here too, just look at this little boy and notice the prevalence of dogs. I should say, at this time, if you had a dog that wasn't for hunting or wasn't for eating scraps, you were saying you were an aristocrat. All the dogs that we found here are lap dogs so far. They're dogs that sit on people's laps and show their owners to be masters of something very small. Look at this woman's rich, shiny silk dress. Look at the young boy's red velvet coat. These people, frankly, look like snobs. They don't look like people preparing to wage a democratic revolution. And so I think this is a really interesting development. We'll end with this image, which is a little blurry because it's the best resolution I could find of it. But here are Americans engaged in not a hunt for deer or antelope, classic American animals, but they're out hunting foxes, and they've got their hunting dogs with them. This is the classic aristocratic pastime, and these Americans are engaging in it with zeal and fervor. So the point here is not really to prove anything, but rather to suggest that the story is rarely as simple as we want it to be, or even as we think it might be. The most patriotic of Americans in the American Revolution might also be the most snobbish of aristocrats, and that's a contradiction we're going to have to deal with.